Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something real today, something a lot of people don't want to hear, but they need to. When a man goes silent, most women panic. They start explaining, over texting, apologizing for things they didn't even do, trying to fix something that wasn't broken by them in the first place. But the moment you decide to match his silence instead of chasing it, something powerful happens inside that man. See, silence was never meant to push you away forever. For a lot of men, silence is control. It's a way to test how much power they have over your emotions. When you immediately react, when you rush to fill the gap, you're telling him, you still run this. But when you go quiet too, his mind starts working overtime. Silence is not weakness. And I need people to really understand this, especially women who have been taught that being quiet means you're losing. Silence, when chosen consciously, is one of the strongest emotional positions you can ever take. Weakness is reacting without control. Weakness is chasing answers from someone who has already shown you they're unsure about you. Silence, on the other hand, is restraint. It's emotional discipline. It's knowing that not every feeling deserves a response, and not every situation deserves your energy. When you stop talking, stop explaining, stop trying to prove your worth. You're not giving up power, you're reclaiming it. A lot of people think strength looks loud. They think strength is arguing, defending yourself, demanding clarity, demanding attention. But real strength is the ability to sit in discomfort without panicking. It's the ability to let things unfold without forcing an outcome. When you choose silence, you're telling the world, and more importantly, yourself, that you trust your value even when no one is validating it. That kind of confidence doesn't need noise. See, when someone goes silent on you, the natural instinct is to fill the gap. You want to talk because silence feels like rejection. But what most people don't realize is that rushing to speak often comes from fear, not love. Fear of losing someone, fear of being forgotten, fear of not being enough. When you recognize that and choose silence instead, you interrupt that fear cycle. You're no longer operating from desperation, you're operating from self-respect. Silence gives you time to think clearly. When emotions are high, logic is low. Words spoken in emotional moments often do more damage than good. Silence protects you from saying things you'll later regret. It allows you to observe instead of react. And observation is power. When you're quiet, you start seeing people for who they really are, not who you hoped they would be. You notice who steps up, who checks in, who takes responsibility, and who disappears when effort is required. Another thing about silence is that it forces accountability without confrontation. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop over justifying your feelings, and you stop chasing clarity, people are left alone with their behavior. They can no longer blame your reactions, your emotions, or your words. All that's left is what they did and how it made you respond by stepping back. That kind of silence hits harder than any argument ever could. Silence also builds emotional authority. When you don't rush to respond, people take you more seriously. They know you're not easily shaken. They know you won't beg for attention or validation. This doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care enough about yourself to not abandon your dignity. Emotional authority comes from consistency, boundaries, and calmness, not from explaining yourself repeatedly to people who already understand, but choose not to change. There's also peace in silence. Constant communication during emotional turmoil is exhausting. It drains your spirit. Silence gives you space to breathe, to reset, to reconnect with yourself. It reminds you that your happiness doesn't depend on someone else's response time or emotional availability. When you're silent, you're no longer handing control of your emotions to someone who hasn't earned that power. Silence teaches patience. It teaches you to wait without anxiety, to sit with uncertainty without collapsing. And patience is a sign of maturity. It shows that you trust life to reveal what needs to be revealed. You stop forcing answers and start allowing truth to surface naturally. People who belong in your life won't be threatened by your silence. They'll be drawn to your calm. Most importantly, silence strengthens your self-respect. Every time you choose not to chase, not to beg, not to argue for your place, you reinforce the belief that you are enough as you are. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop shrinking yourself to be heard. And once you internalize that, your presence becomes powerful, even when you say nothing at all. That's why silence isn't weakness. It's composure. It's self-control. It's emotional intelligence in action. And when used with intention, silence becomes one of the strongest statements you'll ever make. When you stop chasing and you stop filling the space he created with his silence, something shifts that most people never talk about. A man is used to cause and effect. He does something and he expects a response. When that response doesn't come, his mind doesn't rest, it starts working. The absence of your reaction forces him to confront uncertainty, and uncertainty is uncomfortable for a man because it removes his sense of control. At first, he assumes you'll reach out. He believes you'll check and ask what's wrong or try to smooth things over. That expectation is based on patterns. If you've always been the one to fix things, to communicate, to hold the emotional weight, he expects you to continue. When you don't, the silence becomes loud in his head. He starts wondering why the pattern changed. And when patterns change, people feel threatened. That's when self-reflection begins. Without your emotional energy present, he no longer has a distraction. He starts replaying the last conversation, the last moment, the last message. He analyzes his tone, his words, his actions, not because you told him to, but because your absence demands it. Silence removes the safety net that allowed him to act carelessly, knowing you would always be there to cushion the impact. Matching his silence also forces him to feel the weight of potential loss. Loss doesn't always show up as heartbreak right away. Sometimes it shows up as anxiety, restlessness, and overthinking. He starts to feel what it's like to not have access to you. Not knowing where you stand makes him question whether he still matters to you, and that uncertainty touches his ego. Men feel deeply, but they often process emotions through thought rather than expression. Your silence pushes him into that internal processing. Another thing that happens is he starts to reassess your value. When you were always available, always responding, always trying, your presence may have felt guaranteed. And anything that feels guaranteed is often taken for granted. Silence breaks that illusion. It signals that you are not endlessly accessible, that your time and energy are not automatic. That realization can trigger respect because people value what they can lose. He may also feel a sense of accountability. Without an argument to defend himself in, without you explaining how you feel, he has nowhere to hide. There's no emotional chaos to distract from the core issue. All that's left is his behavior and the consequences of it. Silence doesn't accuse, but it exposes. It quietly asks a question he can't ignore. Was I right or did I push too far? There's also a moment where pride and fear collide. His pride tells him not to reach out first, not to show vulnerability. His fear tells him that if he doesn't act, he might lose you completely. That internal conflict can be intense. And while you may not see it, that tension is often what leads him to either step up with intention or step away entirely. Either outcome brings clarity. When you stop chasing, you also stop feeding an imbalance. Relationships often fail not because of lack of love, but because of unequal effort. One person overfunctions while the other underfunctions. By matching his silence, you're restoring balance. You're no longer carrying the emotional responsibility alone. You're allowing him to meet you where you are, or not meet you at all. Silence also gives you back your power. While he's busy overthinking, you're regaining emotional stability. You're no longer reacting from hurt or confusion. You're choosing peace over chaos. That shift in energy is felt, even if it's never spoken about. People sense when you're no longer desperate for their attention. And here's the truth most people don't want to admit. If your silence causes him to disappear, he was never going to stay when things got real anyway. But if your silence causes him to reflect, to reach out with clarity and effort, then you know the connection was real. Either way, matching his silence reveals the truth without you having to say a single word. When silence enters a relationship, it often exposes more truth than words ever could. Many people believe that communication means constant talking, constant explaining, constant fixing. But there comes a moment when continuing to speak only weakens your position. Matching his silence is not about punishment or playing games. It is about shifting the emotional dynamic so that both people are equally responsible for what happens next. The moment you stop filling the quiet with effort, the balance of power begins to change. A man is very aware of patterns, even if he doesn't openly admit it. If you have always been the one reaching out, checking in, and keeping the connection alive, that pattern becomes his comfort zone. He may not consciously disrespect you, but he grows accustomed to your availability. When that suddenly stops, it disrupts his sense of stability. Silence removes predictability, and predictability is where comfort lies. Without it, his mind starts searching for answers. One of the first emotions he feels is confusion. He wonders why you didn't react the way you normally would. He questions whether you're upset, tired, or simply done. That confusion quickly turns into self-doubt. He begins to question whether his actions were acceptable, whether he misjudged your tolerance, whether he assumed too much. Silence creates a mirror he cannot avoid looking into. Matching his silence also introduces emotional distance, and distance has a powerful effect. When someone feels emotionally close to you, they assume access. They assume they can come and go, pull back and return without consequence. Silence interrupts that access. It sends a message that emotional closeness requires mutual effort, not one-sided pursuit. This realization can be unsettling, especially for someone who believed your presence was guaranteed. Another thing that happens internally is the emergence of insecurity. Not insecurity in a weak sense, but the kind that forces reflection. He begins to imagine scenarios. Are you talking to someone else? Have you emotionally checked out? Are you happier without him? These questions arise because silence removes reassurance. And when reassurance disappears, people are forced to face the possibility of loss. Loss, even the idea of it, has a way of sharpening awareness. He starts to remember the things you did, the support you offered, the consistency you brought. The absence of those things makes their value clearer. What once felt normal now feels missing. Silence has a way of turning overlooked effort into something noticeable. There is also an emotional recalibration that takes place. When you stop reacting, you stop feeding the emotional loop. Arguments, explanations, and emotional reactions often allow problems to repeat without resolution. Silence breaks that loop. It forces a pause. And in that pause, he must decide whether the connection matters enough to him to take responsibility. Matching silence also tests intention. Anyone can stay when things are easy. Anyone can enjoy attention without earning it. But when effort is required, true intentions surface. If he reaches out with sincerity, accountability, and clarity, it shows emotional maturity. If he withdraws further, it reveals avoidance. Silence brings these truths to the surface without confrontation. While he is processing, something important is happening within you as well. Silence gives you space to detach emotionally from the outcome. You begin to regain your center. Instead of waiting anxiously for a message, you return to yourself. That shift changes your energy. You're no longer reacting, you're observing. And observation brings clarity. As you grow calmer, your standards rise naturally. You begin to see the situation more clearly without the fog of emotion. You recognize what you deserve and what you've been tolerating. Silence creates room for self, respect to re-enter the picture. You stop measuring your worth by someone else's attention. This is why matching his silence is powerful. It forces both people to confront the truth. It reveals whether the connection is built on mutual respect or convenience. It exposes effort, intention, and emotional availability. And while silence may feel uncomfortable at first, it often leads to the most honest outcomes because it allows actions to speak where words have failed. Without subheading and conclusion, when a man no longer has access to you the way he once did, uncertainty begins to take over his emotional world, and that feeling is far more powerful than most people realize. Access is comfort. Access is reassurance. Access is knowing that no matter what happens, you are still there, still available, still emotionally reachable. When that access disappears through your silence, it creates a psychological shift that forces him to confront emotions he may have been avoiding. At first, the uncertainty feels subtle. He checks his phone more often. He notices the absence of your name on his screen. He realizes that the rhythm he grew used to has changed. Even if he was the one who went silent first, he expected control over the pace of the connection. When you match his silence, you take that control away. He no longer knows where he stands, and not knowing creates discomfort. Men often rely on emotional access as a form of stability even when they don't admit it. Knowing you're there gives him confidence. Knowing he can reach you whenever he wants gives him security. When that certainty is removed, his mind starts filling the gaps with questions. Is she upset, or is she done? Did I push her too far? Is she realizing she deserves more? These questions don't come from weakness. They come from the fear of losing something valuable without warning. Uncertainty also affects a man's ego. Ego isn't just pride, it's identity. When he no longer has access to your attention, your validation, your emotional presence, he starts questioning his importance in your life. He wonders if he still matters. He wonders if he misjudged how much you cared. Silence quietly challenges his assumptions, and that challenge forces self-reflection. What makes this uncertainty powerful is that it can't be argued away. You're not accusing him. You're not demanding explanations. You're not asking for reassurance. You're simply unavailable. And unavailability forces a man to confront the possibility that you are no longer emotionally dependent on him. That realization can be deeply unsettling, especially if he assumed you would always be there no matter what. As the uncertainty grows, memory steps in. He begins replaying moments he once overlooked, the support you gave, the effort you made, the consistency you showed. Things that felt normal before now feel significant because they are missing. Silence creates contrast, and contrast highlights value. He begins to see that access to you was not guaranteed. It was earned and perhaps taken for granted. Another layer of uncertainty comes from imagination. When you are silent, he doesn't know what you're doing or who you're talking to. His mind fills in the blanks. Are you happier? Are you moving on? Are you realizing you don't need him the way he thought? These imagined scenarios intensify the emotional pressure. Silence leaves room for possibility, and possibility makes people anxious when they are unsure of their place. This uncertainty often creates an internal conflict. Part of him wants to reach out, to restore access, to reestablish certainty. Another part of him struggles with pride, fear of rejection, or avoidance of responsibility. That internal tension forces a decision. Either he steps forward with intention and clarity, or he retreats completely. Silence brings that crossroads into focus. What's important is that during this time, you are no longer trying to convince him of your worth. You're no longer explaining your feelings or negotiating your place in his life. By removing access, you communicate self-respect without saying a word. And that self-respect changes how you are perceived. A woman who can step back calmly is seen as emotionally strong, not desperate. Uncertainty also teaches boundaries. It shows that emotional access to you is not automatic. It must be maintained through effort, respect, and consistency. When a man realizes that access can be lost, he begins to understand the importance of how he shows up. Silence becomes the teacher that words failed to be. And while he is dealing with uncertainty, something equally important is happening within you. You are reclaiming emotional space. You are detaching from constant anticipation. You are learning that your peace does not depend on someone else's availability. That shift changes your energy, and people feel it. When you are no longer waiting, chasing, or explaining, you become grounded. This is why uncertainty is so powerful when access is removed. It exposes assumptions, challenges complacency, and forces emotional truth to surface. Silence doesn't create distance to punish, it creates clarity. And clarity reveals whether someone truly values you or simply valued the access they once had. When silence removes emotional reactions from the equation, a man is left alone with his thoughts, and that is where real realization begins. Arguments, explanations, and emotional responses often give him something to react against. They create noise that distracts from the core issue. But silence strips all of that away. It creates a quiet space where excuses no longer work and avoidance becomes impossible. In that quiet, his mind starts revisiting moments he once dismissed. He replays conversations, messages, and situations not from a defensive place, but from a reflective one. Without your emotional presence guiding the narrative, he has to supply his own interpretation. That's when he begins to notice things he overlooked before. The times you showed patience, the times you compromised, the times you gave more than you received. Silence has a way of turning background effort into something impossible to ignore. Reflection brings awareness, and awareness brings regret. Not always immediately, and not always in dramatic ways, but subtly and steadily. He begins to see the gap between what he did and what he should have done. When you're no longer explaining how you feel, he can no longer minimize it or dismiss it as overreaction. Your silence validates your feelings more powerfully than words ever could. Another thing that happens in this space is responsibility. Without conflict to hide behind, he has to own his role. Silence doesn't accuse, but it also doesn't rescue. It doesn't reassure him that everything is fine. It doesn't soften the consequences of his actions. It simply allows those consequences to exist. And sitting with consequences forces growth, or it reveals emotional immaturity. Silence also challenges a man's sense of control. Control often comes from knowing how someone will respond. If he knows you'll argue, explain, or chase, he feels safe in his behavior. When you remove that predictability, he loses leverage. He can't anticipate your next move. That uncertainty pushes him into self-evaluation. He starts asking himself whether his behavior aligns with the outcome he wants. As reflection deepens, emotions begin to surface. Not just regret, but fear. Fear of losing something meaningful. Fear of being replaced. Fear of realizing too late that he undervalued someone who genuinely cared. Silence makes these fears louder because there's nothing to drown them out. The absence of your voice amplifies his inner dialogue. There is also a shift in perception that occurs. When you stop reacting emotionally, you are no longer seen as impulsive or dependent. You are seen as composed. That composure changes how your absence is interpreted. Instead of assuming you're upset and waiting, he starts to consider that you may be choosing peace. That thought alone is powerful. It suggests strength, independence, and self-respect. This period of silence often leads him to reassess the connection itself. He begins to question whether he invested enough, whether he took responsibility seriously, whether he assumed your presence instead of appreciating it. Silence becomes a mirror reflecting the imbalance that may have existed. And mirrors are uncomfortable because they don't lie. While he is processing all of this, you are no longer feeding the emotional cycle. You are no longer reacting from pain or confusion. You are giving yourself space to heal, to think, and to regain clarity. Silence protects your emotional energy. It keeps you from pouring into someone who may not be pouring back. The most important realization silence brings is that effort is a choice. If he chooses to step forward after reflection, it will be with intention, accountability, and clarity. If he chooses not to, then silence has revealed the truth without you having to beg, argue, or explain. Either outcome provides honesty. Reflection is uncomfortable, but it is necessary for growth. Silence creates the environment where reflection thrives. It removes distractions, forces accountability, and allows reality to settle in. When a man is left alone with his thoughts, he either rises to meet the moment or reveals that he was never prepared to meet you where you stand. When your absence replaces constant communication, it speaks in a language far stronger than words ever could. People underestimate the power of absence because they believe value is proven by effort, by availability, by showing up no matter what. But true value is often recognized only when it is no longer easily accessible. When you step back and allow absence to take your place, it forces a man to confront emotions he may have been ignoring. Absence creates contrast. When you are always present, your role in his life blends into the background. Your support, your consistency, your emotional availability start to feel normal. Not unimportant, but expected. The moment you remove yourself, that normal disappears. What was once familiar becomes missing, and the human mind reacts strongly to what is missing. Absence turns overlooked effort into something noticeable. Without your messages, your calls, your emotional check-ins, he becomes aware of the silence in a different way. It's not just quiet, it's a void. That void forces him to recognize how much space you actually occupied in his life. He notices the lack of warmth, the lack of reassurance, the lack of connection. Absence makes emotional contributions visible by removing them. Another powerful effect of absence is that it shifts focus inward. When you're present, you often absorb emotional responsibility. You explain, you clarify, you comfort. When you're absent, that responsibility falls back on him. He has to sit with his thoughts. He has to process his emotions without leaning on your support. That internal processing can be uncomfortable, but it's also revealing. Absence also removes the illusion of permanence. Many people assume that someone who has always been there will always remain there. That assumption leads to complacency. When your absence challenges that belief, it introduces urgency. He begins to understand that relationships are not sustained by assumption, but by consistent effort. The idea that you might not return creates a sense of accountability. There is also an emotional awakening that happens in absence. He begins to feel things he avoided before: loneliness, regret, appreciation, fear of loss. These emotions don't surface when everything feels secure. They surface when security is threatened. Absence threatens emotional security, and in doing so, reveals what truly matters. Your absence also changes how you are perceived. Instead of being seen as someone who will always adjust, always wait, always forgive, you are seen as someone who values their peace. That shift commands respect. People respect what is boundaries. Absence is a boundary expressed through action rather than words. While he is dealing with the impact of your absence, something transformative is happening within you. You are reclaiming your time, your emotional energy, and your sense of self. You are no longer centering your emotions around his responses. That internal shift strengthens you. You begin to realize that your happiness is not dependent on his attention. That realization is empowering. Absence also creates clarity. When you step back, you see the situation more objectively. You see patterns, imbalances, and truths that were hard to notice when you were emotionally invested. Absence removes emotional fog. It allows you to assess whether the connection aligns with your values and needs. The most important thing absence communicates is self-worth. Without saying a word, you are stating that your presence is valuable and not guaranteed. You are showing that access to you requires respect, effort, and consistency. This message is far stronger than any ultimatum or explanation. When absence speaks, it doesn't beg, it doesn't argue, it doesn't chase, it simply exists. And in that existence, it reveals truth. It shows whether someone truly values you or only valued your availability. Absence becomes the final test of emotional investment, because what is real will respond and what is not will fade away.